guys, Ella here. Welcome back to another session. So in the last session, if you're watching these in order, we covered what actually is motivation, what higher quality of motivation is, and then we spoke a little bit about how we get that high level of motivation or better quality motivation in our clients. And ultimately it comes down to how well that we, through our communication and our program, are able to meet our clients' 3 psychological needs. Okay, and we discussed that these core needs were autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And if in any way our communication or our program is kind of thwarting those needs, then it's going to lead to a reduction in the client's quality of motivation. Okay, and this is actually really great because rather than from the start thinking that a motivation is just down to the person and it's all on them, we now realize that there are things that we can do to change that and to actually improve someone's motivation. And so that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to go in detail about ways of communicating that are called need supportive, right? And simply, it's need supportive communication because it supports these 3 psychological needs. And if we communicate in these kind of ways, it's going to improve the quality of motivation. And if we imagine that continuum, we're going to move them on the continuum from the left more across to the right. Okay. So if you guys are nerds who like digging into the literature, you'll find some of the stuff in this paper. That's a really, really useful paper actually for practitioners. So I would definitely recommend looking at that, but that's just a bit of context. Now, you saw this in the first session, but it's going to make more sense now that we've gone through these factors of motivation, okay? But we spoke a little bit about being directive and being non-directive. And we spoke about how you can exist on a continuum and how you can use different types at different times. But directive forms of motivation, which is when we're giving somebody advice or we're instructing them, that doesn't map on very well to one of the core psychological needs, which is that sense of autonomy, right? It also doesn't map very well onto competence, because if we're always telling somebody what to do, that's going to undermine them feeling very competent. But having said that, right, there are also times where we do need to give advice. And so that's why it's really important to understand this scale and to understand the different modes of communication that are available to us so we can make sure we're making the right choices. If we're only being directive, so we're only being the expert and we're telling them all the time, we're giving them advice and we're problem solving, then we are going to experience, or clients are going to experience, a lower quality of motivation because they're going to have that sensation of being controlled, like they don't have any choice, like they don't have any autonomy. But at the other end of the scale, if we're only ever being non-directive and we're never actually giving advice or we're never actually instructing, then sometimes that's going to undermine a client's sense of competence. Okay, so hopefully now the pieces are starting to click together a little bit more. I definitely recommend you watching these videos a few times because you're going to get something new each time and you'll notice that it starts to make more and more sense. But then we took this one step further and we explored about how the same idea, maybe somebody not feeling very full up, right, and noticing that they're snacking, how that could lead to us having a whole different types of responses. We could be quite directive on the left where we might tell them to eat more protein because we know that that's going to help, all the way to the right hand side where we're not actually giving them any solutions. Instead, we're going to be really non-directive and we're going to be asking them what they think. Okay, so just a reminder of this slide and that there are lots of different ways of saying the same thing. With this in mind, let's get into the specifics of need supportive communication. So, first need then is autonomy. And as a reminder, this is that a person needs to feel a sense of control and a sense of choice over their behaviour. And so when we're doing things in our program, whether it comes down to programming their exercise, it's their nutrition, it's all these different things, they have to feel some sense of autonomy. And so the specific things and how this relates to our communication, that's what we're going to go through now. So the first one, when we're communicating with clients, as much as possible, we want to avoid using controlling language, right? And controlling language would be utilizing words like you should do this, you need to do this, it must do this. If a person already has poor quality of motivation, so remember, go back to the motivation session and have a look at the stuff on the left-hand side, the things that are in red. If the client's already sitting there, and then we're using this controlling language, it's going to continue to reinforce that, and it's going to be really difficult for the client to experience higher quality forms of motivation, okay? So check your language. Go back through the messages that you've sent clients, go back through the replies to check-ins, think about how you communicate with a person if you're working with them face-to-face, and think, do I say this stuff often? Rather than saying should, need, must, you could say can, would you like? What do you think, right? You might want to try this. How would this feel? What would this be like? Okay, so rather than that use of controlling language, we're using different forms of language. Another thing that's really important is that sometimes in coaching, yes, you do have to advise people, right? You do have to tell them what to do, otherwise they wouldn't know. But if you remember from the motivation session, the worst quality form of motivation was no motivation. And that was when a person doesn't see the value in something or they don't think they're capable. And so if they don't see the value in something, they're not going to do it. And so that's why we must explore our clients' perspectives. So rather than just thinking, right, this person, why they're not squatting or why they're not doing this, we have to understand. So we want to explore their point of view. You know, what do they think about squats? You know, why is it they don't find them valuable? And by exploring that, we start to really understand what's going on and we can start breaking down those barriers. Another thing, really, really important. This is a quick tip that we can use straight away. Before we go to give advice, right, before we go to offer a solution, can we just get into the habit of asking permission? Okay, so instead, when a person is saying to us, oh, you know, I'm not able to do my steps, I don't have time, and, you know, blah, 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 rather than just saying, hey, look, why don't you go on your lunch break, right? Or why don't you get up an hour earlier? Or why don't you do this, which is providing a solution? Instead, we might say, hey, look, I noticed that you're struggling with this. Would you mind if I gave you some advice? Or how would you feel about me offering some sort of suggestions because I've got some ideas? Or would you like to hear some of my ideas? What happens then is it's super powerful because we've asked for that permission and they then give us the permission. They are more open to hearing our solution and what we have to say. And the reason for that is that because they have given us permission, it gives them a sense of autonomy. They have chosen or they have controlled that they want to receive the feedback. So that's really quick, important tip that you can start doing when you want to give your clients some feedback or some solutions. The next one, you guys are great at this, right? Understand what's important to them. So do they really have to do squats? Do they really have to eat X amount of protein? You know, for some of these behaviors, it might, you know, if they want to, for example, compete in a bodybuilding competition or they want to grow their leg muscles, whatever it is, they might actually have to do that thing. And in which case, what we will then do is we'll explain that process to them and say, hey, look, I know that squats aren't your favorite, but they're really the best thing that you could be doing for your goal. How does that sound? Do you think that's something that you'll be able to work with? If not, do you understand that by not doing them, it's going to be harder to get to your goal? And then we have that dialogue. Okay, so we try to understand what is important. And if they really don't like something, it's understanding that we can swap it out as long as we have that communication. And then the simplest thing that we can do, the easiest thing that we can do when it comes to enhancing autonomy is make sure we provide choice. So there's no reason necessarily why we have to just give them things to do. What we can do is we can approach it like a menu. Hey, when I reprogram you next time, would you prefer to do leg extensions or would you prefer to do this? Right? Would you prefer to focus on portion sizes or would you prefer to track your calories? Because a lot of coaches, oftentimes, when we talk about giving client choice, there can be this fear of, God, if I give them choice, they're going to pick the wrong things. Or what if they don't pick anything that's helpful? So what we do is we give them a list of pre-selected choices to choose from, like a menu. And so they still have that sense of choice because they're picking which option they like, but it's from a list that we've already pre-approved. Okay, so this can be a really helpful tool. How much choice are you giving your client? How much collaboration is there? How much sense of control does a client have over what it is that they're doing in your program? Now, here are some examples. Okay, this is by no means perfect. It depends on the situation, but here are some ways that you would take a really common phrase that we might say and how we would translate it into something that is more autonomy supportive. So the first one, rather than saying you should start eating more protein, we might want to say, would you mind if I gave you some advice? How would you feel about increasing protein as it may help with your cravings? Right, so what we're doing there is we're asking permission. And then what we're doing is we're asking for their feelings about doing a certain behavior instead of just telling them to do a behavior. And what this does is it just increases the buy-in, right? We're more likely to get them to adhere to what we're doing by just adding that extra layer, right? This is the real important parts of coaching here. It's the nuances. The next one. I know you're not a fan of squats, but they're really important if you want to get stronger. Maybe we could say something like, would you prefer leg extensions, leg press, or squats? That's that autonomy component, right? The providing choice component. Or what we could do is we could provide a real rationale as to why we believe that squats are the best, but we can ultimately hand it over to the client to make the decision. And the final one on there, you missed hitting your step target again this week. We really need to make sure we're getting it. Okay, so we're saying you need to do this, you need to do that. That's that controlling sense. That's us telling them what to do. It's that word, that controlling use of language. Okay, whereas instead, as a coach, if we're being a bit more non-directive, if we want to improve motivation, if you want to get better outcomes, we might switch to something like, what are your thoughts on the step target? Is there a target you would prefer? What is it that you want to aim for? It's collaborative, right? We're bringing in that sense of conversation, communication, that's going to allow the client to feel far more heard, and we may end up just getting to the same outcome. Or by communicating with them like that, we're going to figure out what the barriers are in the first place. Like, rather than just saying to them, hey, just do the steps, we're going to explore, like, what is getting in the way? Is there something here that we're missing? All right, let's move on to the next need. And the next need is competence. And as a quick reminder, this is that as humans, we have to feel like we are good at something, right? We have to feel like we're either getting better or we're capable. If we're always feeling like we're failing and we're not able to do the thing, it's so unmotivating, right? It will definitely undermine our motivation. And so what this specifically looks like for your communication and for your program is really hitting those optimal performance or challenge levels, okay? Think Goldilocks. Not too easy, not too hard, but just right. Yeah. And it's a constant balance, because sometimes a client will be on a roll and they'll be building momentum and they'll be asking you to make it harder. And we have to be really careful, because how many times is a client on a roll and then as soon as you make changes to their program, they stop, right? Because there's something that happens there with their sense of competence. And we have to, like I said, we have to be constantly switched on and dynamic to this process, because sometimes a client will feel overwhelmed, they'll get busy. And so what they were doing last week now becomes too difficult. And then we need to reduce that challenge level so they still feel as though they're being successful because we've reduced the challenge. What we also need to do here is we need to clarify expectations. Like, what do they expect to happen? What are we expecting to happen? Can we clarify that? Because if a person thinks that they're going to do certain behaviors and it's going to lead to a certain outcome and that doesn't happen, that's going to make them feel less motivated about that situation. So we want to clarify their expectations. In order to help a person feel competent, we also need to address their obstacles. And so what this would look like is when you're doing your check-in and you would ask the client, what 3 things do you want to focus on this week? And they might say something along the lines of, I'd like to get my 3 workouts in. You would then go through the process of addressing the obstacles. So you might say, that sounds great. What might stop you from doing your 3 workouts? And they might say, I might get busy with the kids, or I might get tired, or it might be dark. And then what you would say is, okay, great. And so what would you do in those situations? So what happens there is when a person can identify the obstacle and they can identify the way that they are going to overcome that obstacle, that massively increases their confidence, right? It massively increases the competence and the feeling of self-efficacy that they're going to be able to do the thing. And we know, if we know one thing from psychology, is that self-efficacy or confidence in something is the biggest predictor of behavior. And so if we can make a client more and more confident they can do it, they're going to be more likely to do it. And then the final one of competence then is to create a clear action plan. If we provide clarity and we've got a clear action plan, then a client is going to feel like they're competent because they can see the steps on the journey. They see where they are, they see the steps that are required, and they understand what they need to do, which becomes really helpful in terms of competence. All right, there's a lot of text here, okay, but we'll go into this. So if a client wants to hit the gym 4 times per week, but they haven't yet developed consistency, how often do you see this happening? Clients trying to run before they walk. And then how do we deal with that? Because we don't want to just stamp on their motivation. We want to encourage them, wanting to do these things. But at the same time, if they're not already hitting it, we know they're not going to be able to achieve that thing, which would be really demoralizing. So this is one way that you might want to handle that certain situation. Hey, I love that you're aiming for 4 sessions. It really shows how much you care about this process, right? So we're having the praise there. We're matching their excitement level. I've noticed that you find it challenging hitting 3 sessions before. Would it work if we had a range of 2 to 4 sessions to hit? That way, when you're feeling extra motivated, you can hit 4, but when life gets in the way, 2 sessions is great. How does that sound? Okay, so that's one way to handle that sense of competence. It gives them the opportunity to go above and beyond, but we're also accounting for the fact that we need to reduce the challenge level sometimes because we understand that people sometimes can go back and forth. Another example here is that a client hasn't met their nutrition goals for several weeks. Hey, let's really try to focus on the nutrition this week and dial it in, because ultimately you aren't going to get where you want to unless you work on this. That might be that sort of tough love approach, being really directive approach, which from time to time might be helpful, but if that's the only tool that we've got in our toolbox, and if that's the only thing we are, going to every time, we're going to notice that the clients aren't going to get the results that we know they can. So instead, here are some ways that we might want to approach it. We might want to say, would it be okay if we chat about nutrition? You're asking permission. I know that losing weight is really important to you, and you seem to be struggling with nutrition. So what we're doing now is we're putting their goal front and center. It's not coming from judgment. It's not what we think about it. It's because they said that this goal is important to them. And then we've noticed that this thing is occurring. They're not engaging in the behaviors that they need in order to match onto the goal that they want. And so you might then say, what do you think is getting in the way? How do you think you might overcome this? Is there anything I can do to support? And then if they give you some examples or they tell you what they need, you would then ask them to talk you through specifically how they're going to achieve that. And that process of them mapping out the behaviors and planning the behaviors increases their feeling of competence. Okay, it increases their confidence, and so they're more likely to go and do it. That's what excellent coaching looks like. Okay, rather than just telling them to do the nutrition stuff, all that's doing is it's just telling. Yeah, anyone can just tell. We're talking about how we become an excellent coach. This is all the nuances. This is what it takes. And then the final one is about relatedness. So how can we cultivate, I suppose, a really good relationship between you and the client? And obviously this is massive. Yeah, there's loads of things that you can do. There's loads of things that are really important when it comes to building a relationship with somebody. But what I would encourage you to do is just don't underestimate, I should say, the importance of that relationship. Okay, it's not wasted time you building the relationship, because the stronger that is, the more likely they're going to do things that you ask. The trust is going to be there, and so a person will be willing to do things they wouldn't otherwise be willing to do because they trust you, and that's something that we have to earn. So we build this sense of connection between us and the client by showing unconditional positive regard. And what that is that we value them as a person regardless of if they are adhering or not adhering. Okay, so we're not pissed off one week when they're not adhering and then suddenly super full of praise when they are, because all that's doing is it's saying that we only care about them when they're doing as we ask. Okay, so what we're doing is we're showing them unconditional positive regard. It's a key part of change. It's a key part of adherence, right? The client knows that even if they aren't successful, that you're still going to be there, and so they're more likely to check in because they're not scared that you're going to judge them. Okay, the second one, encourage asking of questions. Get them talking, get them asking stuff, get them figuring out their own solutions. The more the client talks, the more connected they're going to feel to you, okay? Because that's what it takes. It requires the person talking to feel connected. So if we're always doing the talking and we're always doing the telling, it doesn't give the client that chance to express their feelings back to us. Then, of course, we've got to show genuine interest. That's, we make sure we understand or we take care of what's going on in their life, how are they in general, showing that we care about them, we actually care about their progress, we're paying attention to details, remembering that kind of stuff. And then really importantly, just make sure we acknowledge their feelings. Yeah, we're not brushing the feelings to the side to get to the goal and being like, right, it doesn't matter about that stuff, let's focus on nutrition, let's focus on training. It's, right, they're telling us they're stressed. There's no point us telling them that that's an excuse. We have to acknowledge, all right, I understand that you're feeling stressed. So now that you are stressed, what can we do with that? What would you like to do? Yes, but we're always acknowledging the feelings first. Okay, yeah, so that pretty much rounds up this session. So far then we've covered loads. We've covered about, being a directive and a non-directive coach. We've spoken about the factors in motivation. And now we've spoken about the key communication strategies that we have to use to enhance motivation and how we might be undermining motivation. So in the final session, we're going to be talking a big session on retention. And so, yeah, look forward to seeing you there.